Hey guys, welcome to Too Complicated for History, Episode 2 Recap. All right, guys, I want to get right into this because we have a lot to talk about today. I have some philosophical questions, some emotional questions. I'm so curious to hear what you guys think. So I'm going to get right into it. The history books in school don't really talk as much about the family dynamics of figures from history, right?
Yeah.
But if you seek out like a book written specifically on an individual from history, it'll go deeper and talk about the family and the relationships. What they still leave out, though, is how that dynamic would influence that individual to then make decisions, right? Emotionally based decisions or causality behind that. Like, I was so angry that it caused me to make a choice like this, right? That like leaving that out often leaves our historical figures feeling like stoic and statuesque. And we've said twice now that history is made up of people. So why is it so difficult for historians to make an emotional approach to the motivations of historical figures and their actions? Lynn, why don't we start with you since you have experience as a historian yourself?
Yeah, well, I can sort of share my experience in grad school and learning how to be a historian. And I think as a historian, we were told it's rather dangerous to go in with any sort of emotion because then it starts to, color your research and your determinations of a historic figure. So ideally, you go into research trying to be as objective as possible. I know in at least my first semester, I tried to do, probably without noticing or realizing what I was doing, I tried to maybe attribute motive to people that there wasn't really enough primary source to be able to do that. So I was reading into them, and I think that's really dangerous, or at least I was taught, don't do that, because it's quite dangerous to almost putting your own time, your own emotions, and your own thoughts, and you're getting into their head. But I think we need to understand that we can't really do that, especially in a time so removed from ours. So the safest way to be a good historian is to use sources, and you can make interpretations of those sources, but when you start to get into the emotional and the psychological and motivations behind things, I think that's when you get into a murky area, unless somebody writes a letter that is pretty clear about I'm doing this because, and if you believe them, if you believe that they're actually being truthful in that letter, you can at least, use that as a source and explain why that might be so. But I was put, pretty much in my first semester in grad school, I was put in my place about, we don't sort of get emotionally involved with our,
Right.
historic subjects and, the people that we're studying, which is understandable. Sometimes it's hard because you end up really liking them after you've researched them a lot. But, we try to stay as objective as possible as human beings.
And I'm just gonna just hop right in here, and that's a really interesting question because I think what happens like from my perspective as a storyteller, what happens is when we're studying history, it kind of sterilizes the emotional feel of like what you're learning because these things that are happening are emotional. There was emotion that happened, and so history class feels like class, and it feels like memorize these moments, and the way it's presented is a little bit more it's so objective, and that's where I think we come in, and like we are trying to without applying motivation, right? um, without conjecture of like what inspired, like what drove someone to do something, we are trying to humanize these people, um, which we did a lot of in our last episode. It was really cool learning about the Marquis and learning about different family dynamics. And there's a really funny story about him and his father-in-law.
Hmm.
So definitely check out the episode because man, to the leaps and bounds he goes to avoid some punishment with his father-in-law is very funny. And so I totally understand where Lynn is coming from, right? Like we're trying to be objective. It's like in our last recap video, I think we talked about interpreting the Constitution, and we don't know entirely what their intention was. And it's like trying to read a text message and convey tone from that. And sometimes it's right on the nose and you totally understand what someone's saying, or other times you're like, oh no, I'm in big trouble. And they're like, dude, I texted you, it's okay. Yeah, but was it it's okay or it's okay, right? So
Right.
and that's where our job is to, what we're doing is trying to make this more compelling and make it feel more emotional without pushing emotion into it ourselves, right?
Right.
You can be emotional about situations. You can be emotional about world wars and even just family dynamics that you learn about, and we can relate to people, especially when we read letters, as far as what their family dynamics were. It's just, I'm totally on board with Lynn saying it is dangerous to apply motivation or feign that the true cause or intention behind something. So
For sure, and actually, to address what both of you said, is I've certainly read text messages that could go one of two ways, and it tends to be more a reflection on the emotional state that I'm in. If I'm in an
Exactly.
angry mood, I'll read that message as angry,
Yep.
and yeah. So, really good
So
point,
true.
guys. Lynn, you mentioned that unless there was a letter written that talks about their emotions or talks about what they're feeling or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Do we have examples of that? Are there letters?
Oh, I mean, absolutely. There are. So, one of my favorite letters of George Washington, since he's the topic of our upcoming docuseries, is that he's very, very frustrated with one of his contractors, who's not doing the work that he should. No offense to contractors, yeah. But he's not doing the work as well as he should be. George Washington's away from home, and he keeps writing to him and saying, hey, what have you done? Where have we advanced to? And it was when he was building his new room. So if you visit Mount Vernon, it's the new room. And finally, he writes to the man and he says, talking to you is like shouting to a bird in the sky. It's like, there's just no point. And it's great because you can tell he's to the point of annoyance that he's like, I may as well just yell at birds because you're not doing what you're supposed to do. So you get that frustration to come through. And it's also so incredibly, I think we can all relate to that. I feel like we've all been annoyed by someone, and
that is
you just
so
kind of
funny.
throw up your arms.
Yeah.
And, I think in that case, you can pretty much get an idea of where he was emotionally with
Yeah.
his contractor.
Yeah.
And there's
Something's
a
never
lot of
changed, I guess.
examples
Yeah.
like
Oh my
that. I
gosh,
mean,
that's so funny.
yeah, and there are a lot as well with. I worked on Martha Washington, and she got dozens of condolence letters when George Washington passed away, and those are very emotional, including one from Lafayette, actually.
Mm.
That's very,
Well,
very sweet, where he says that he looked at George Washington as a father figure.
well, it's funny you should say that because, Lafayette had a complicated relationship with George Washington, viewing him
Mm-hmm.
as a father figure. But as we said in the episode, it's not necessarily that Washington viewed him as a son. It's hard to tell. There's no direct evidence, but
Mm-hmm.
he referred to him as a friend. That relationship makes sense and is a little complicated. There's a lot of dynamics going on. We also talked about how Lafayette had a relationship with Napoleon, which is so
Mm-hmm.
interesting to sort of start bringing that gap together and really
Can,
placing them in time.
can I just say something that might make me sound silly, but uh, and this is just where I'm like excited that I'm learning about history as well. Like George Washington and Napoleon to me are so far apart in my mind in like historical timeline that like Napoleon is might as well be in like ancient times in my mind, right? Whereas like George Washington's so relevant and present to me, and that's
Right.
look, that is a ignorant
It could be where you
perspective
live
where I
too.
learned. Yeah, absolutely. But it is just so funny to me that like, oh, they were at the same time, and like this is what I'm hoping our audience learns and stuff like this.
Absolutely. Well,
Yeah,
and
Yeah.
actually, Lynn, isn't there a famous quote about Napoleon, or that Napoleon said about Washington? and how great he was, and how Napoleon couldn't possibly like do as well as Washington did. Like,
Maybe. I
yeah, it
don't.
was about giving up. I thought it was about giving up power or something, and he was like,
That was actually King George III.
"Oh, it was King George. Oh,
King
okay.
George
See, we're
III
all
said
learning."
if he gives, they won the revolution. We won the revolution, and he said if he gives up power now, then he's basically the I don't know. It was something like the greatest man in the world, because you're giving up. I mean, that's a massive amount of power that he could have wielded after the revolution. I mean, he could have become dictator. He could have become a Napoleon.
King
And
George
so,
Washington.
Right, and he
yeah,
didn't. And
the
I
George to
will have to
George.
look it up because I do remember it stood out. It stood out to me that Napoleon had a quote about Washington for the exact same reason that Pat just said, is that I didn't realize until that moment that these two existed more or less in the same time period.
Yeah, it's wild.
But back to what I was saying is, Lafayette had a relationship with Napoleon as well. It seems that Lafayette, and the episode really highlights this, had a lot of relationships, straightforward and complicated, with so many people. He was an emotional guy. Is that what makes him so complicated? Is that what makes him maybe too complicated for history? Pat?
Yeah, I mean, I think he's yes and no, right? Like, I think it's a really fascinating thing that he stayed so far removed yet so involved, right? And his career was 50 years. I mean, that's unbelievable, and including a time of imprisonment and what is it? Self-isolation, but not self-isolation. Solitary confinement. Yeah, and then comes back out not unscathed, but definitely willing to go back to it. And it he fits the mold of our show perfectly. Like, it's not a philosophical question like what is it to be an American, like our first episode with Dr. Lindsay Chervinsky. Go check it out. And but he is someone that would be described in your history textbook. This is like a perfect example of our deleted scenes of history, right? Like, he in theory could be a forefather, in theory could be, I mean, in the intro to the show, the amount of names or things that are named after him throughout the country is staggering, and yet super relatively unknown. And I knew very little about him until working on the show. I know more people kind of know now more from Hamilton, which I have not seen yet. I know I'm a blasphemer.
Yes, Lafayette liked to sing a lot.
Yeah, exactly.
yeah.
Yeah, and his motivation for that was he wanted to be seen by everyone. No, we don't do that. Yeah, I mean, that's kind of it, right? Is that his journey is not super easily translated to like a high school textbook, when it's like, here's the revolution, you have only so much time to kind of figure out what each person's role was, and then like you get that snippet and then you move on. Whereas in fact, it's a much bigger, more compelling story when you take the time.
I love it.
Right.
And humanizing too. I mean, really, it seems to come up in every episode, and I think there's a reason for that. That people are complicated. I certainly am. I know that.
Complicated Jordan. Yes.
Yeah. I looked it up. So a Napoleon is said to have said. Okay, so I'll make sure I'm clear about that. He is said to have said that he is no Washington when it came to asking him to give up power.
Well,
He was like,
that's a fact.
Yeah, well, that is also a fact. But he is said to have uttered those words rather than just having lived them. So yeah,
that's cool.
Well, guys, I want to start keeping these episodes a little bit more direct. So I just wanted to ask those two questions today. I really love the answers. I think that they are both applicable for this episode, for our previous episodes, for our show, and for our future shows. So thank you so much for answering with such clarity. I do want to thank you both for joining me today. And I want everyone to check out the episode with Mike Duncan, our second episode, which is live right now. Please download it, subscribe, share it with friends, listen to it twice, actually, if you would, and then
then go
send it
read his
to everyone.
book.
And go read his book. Can you plug
'Cause you're
it?
gonna
Plug
want
it for
to.
us. Yeah. What's the name of it?
A Hero of Two Worlds.
Of Two Worlds by Mike
Mhm.
Duncan. Listen to his podcast wherever you get podcasts, and ours as well. Listen to ours twice, though. Okay? All right, guys. Thank you so much. I will see you next time.
Thanks, Jordan.
Thanks.